Thank you, Heather. Among my various and storied gifts and traits, it's like I started that. Anyway, or though how am I working here now? Yeah, there I'm going now. I got you. Okay. One of the things that over time, in terms of tasks and responsibilities I've picked up is in our house, I'm also the barber. And I've given a lot of haircuts at this point. I haven't cut Catherine or Caroline's hair, but all the boys' haircuts I have done for a long time now. That is until Nathan got a job, and then he decided he was too good for a store-bought haircut. Anyway, but I've got plenty of other returning customers, and I've given a lot of haircuts. I cut my hair twice a week. I cut the other boys' hair about every 3 weeks. And so over time, that's a lot of haircuts. And it's wonderful because you don't have to make appointments. We have saved a stack of money. But it's also been a learning experience, something that I've taken away from some very important and valuable lessons. And so you're probably wondering, oh, Michael, please tell me, what are those valuable lessons that you have learned? Well, I'm glad you asked, so let me share them with you. The first is this. It is important when getting a haircut that people sit still. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it especially, like for a 4-year-old, it is very, very important, unless you're trying to carve initials into their head, you need them to sit still. And so that sometimes is a task, but it's a very important task. It is also important to have clippers that are sharp. When I first started doing this, I'd gotten clippers at Sam's or Costco, and I think a lot of times they'll have them on sale, and you can buy a set of clippers with a set of guards for like $30. It's a great deal. And I just kind of assume that you have that until the motor starts working. Not true. Because what will happen, and this is when you know that it's time to change clippers, when you're cutting their hair and their head starts going back like this. And if somebody starts crying because you're pulling their hair, quiet haircut. It tells you that they're dull. They're dull. So it's important to have sharp clippers. So make them sit still. Make sure that the clippers are sharp. But the other thing is this. I have discovered that hair that has been cut off cannot be put back on. I don't know if you're aware of that. You can take it off, but you can't put it back on. And so I've got a typical routine as to how I begin. And most of the time, I'll start on the sides before I deal with the top. And if I start with the sides and I cut too short to begin with, well, that affects the rest of the haircut. And so one of the things that I have discovered with respect to haircutting is make sure that you get a good start, because if you don't get a good start, that's going to adversely affect everything that follows. But that's true not just with haircuts, it's true with a lot of things in life, and it's true with some spiritual aspects of our life as well. We've been working our way through the life of Gideon, and one of the things that we have seen is that God has been working in his life to identify a need and a task that he wants him to be involved in, something that he wants him to do. And that begs the question, when Gideon got a task, when God gave him something to do, how did he start? Because a good start does matter. It is of consequence. Now, it is almost certain that God is not going to lead you, as he did Gideon, to overthrow an enemy army and to liberate your people. He's probably not going to be doing that, but it is certain that God is going to open up doors of opportunity to create tasks that he wants you to be involved in, that he invites you to be used by him in. And it begs the question, well, how do you start? Do you just start? You know, God's told me to do this, so just go ahead and begin that. That's what we're going to think about today, the answer to that question. Once God has given me a task, how do I actually begin? We see the answer to that in Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6, we're going to start reading with verse 25, where we're told, on that very night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Take your father's young bull and a second bull 7 years old. Then tear down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Build a well-constructed altar to the Lord your God on the top of this mound. Take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his male servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his father's family and the men of the city to do it in the daytime, he did it at night. When the men of the city got up in the morning, they found Baal's altar torn down, the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull offered up on the altar that had been built. And they said to each other, "Who did this?" And after they made a thorough investigation, they said, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." And then the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son, he must die, because he tore down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Would you plead Baal's case for him? Would you save him? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If he is a god," that is, if Baal is a god, "let him plead his own case, because someone tore down his altar." And that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, since Joash said, "Let Baal contend with him, because he tore down his altar." All right, God has given Gideon a task. God will give you and does. In fact, maybe it is that he's been using this series away from here. He's been putting a burden on your heart, something that he wants you to be involved in. How do you start? How do you begin once he's tasked you with something? Based on what we see here with Gideon, I believe that the first step is this: start clean. Start clean. So that we're on the same page, think about what's going on. You have God's people, we talked about this before, they have been acting like anything other than God's people for a long time. And they have been picking up the pagan secular practices of all their neighbors, all the injustice, all the idolatry and idol worship that has been going on by their neighbors. That has become part and parcel for the people of God. And so what God does is to use an enemy, the Midianites, who for a period of 7 years constantly keep coming in regularly and taking anything that they want, whether it's herd, whether it's flock, whether it's animal, whether it is farm equipment, whether it is harvest, whatever. And so anything that is of value that they're trying to hold on to, they've got to hide it because, well, the Midianites are going to take it. And so year after year, they get weaker and weaker and weaker. They've got fewer animals, smaller harvest, less food, less everything. Things are really bad. They call out to the Lord saying, "Hey, God, please help us." And God responds by sending a prophet to say, "Listen, this is happening because you decided you needed to pay no attention to me. You could act like not my people, and I would be okay with that, and I'm not." So God has gotten their attention, and now he's raised up Gideon. He's tasked Gideon. He sent an angel to converse with him to say, "Listen, I want you to be the one that throws off this Midianite oppression." Gideon hears that. We talked about last week how he wanted to make sure that God was in this because he was from an inconsequential tribe. He was from a non-influential small family, and he was the youngest guy in his family. And so in spite of all of those excuses, God has made very clear, "You're the guy that I want." Maybe it is that God has been saying to you, in spite of all your excuses and all the rational arguments that you could say, this is why you shouldn't be using me. God knows that, but still it may be that he's saying, "I want you to do X." As he does that, how do you start? Do you just start going gangbusters? This is what God called me to, so I'm just going to go ahead and start that. After all, God has called Gideon to throw off the Midianite oppression. So is he supposed to just start drawing up battle plans? What does he do? We see in this passage that on the very night that God confirmed this is what I want you to do, God tells him to do something. And he doesn't say to launch an attack. He doesn't say to conspire with your people and to start coming up with a plan. He says, "I want you to take your father's young bull and then a second bull that's 7 years old. Tear down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father." So your dad, who's also part of the people of God, has an altar to Baal. Now understand at this point things that are true that we know of Gideon. He is of the tribe of Manasseh. He is young. He's the youngest in his family. Did my mic just die? Okay, I'm sorry. He is the youngest in his family. And at this point, he knows that as being part of the people of God, he knows the stories of how it is that God has worked in the past. He knows at this point that God has brought judgment and consequence on his people. But he knows also of the influence of other cultures right in his own backyard. And so God says, to tear down this altar of Baal, your dad's altar to Baal that belongs to him, and also cut down the Asherah pole. A lot of times, if you'll hear me talk about an Asherah pole, the easiest thing for us to liken it to would be like a totem pole. And it kind of is, in the sense that this is this carved image. But Asherah was actually the female counterpart to Baal. And it was a fertility goddess. And you'd have this tree stump, or this heart of the tree that would be carved typically with exaggerated sexual features, because it was a fertility goddess. And so God says, I want you to tear down the altar to Baal, cut down this Asherah pole. That's, again, this is your dad's. I want you to cut that down. So you take this young bull and you use that to get all this stuff down. And then once it's down, I want you to take the Asherah pole, cut that up, and that's going to serve as firewood. And then I want you to take your dad's bull, his 7-year-old bull, and I want you to slay it and sacrifice it as an altar on the spot where the altar to Baal once stood. Okay. Now, the question in part, though, is, I wonder why he said to take this 7-year-old bull. And like initially, as I was reading that, for some reason that caught my attention, and I thought, I wonder why God mentioned this 7-year-old bull. And I could be wrong, and I don't want to read more in the text than it actually warrants, but I think this is potentially of consequence. How long have God's people been suffering? For 7 years. Any and everything that was of value to them, so that they could hold on to it, what did they do? Well, they would hide it. For 7 years, they've been hiding this bull. Why? Because the bull is valuable. In fact, they have been hiding him the entire time the Midianites have been after him. And God says, I want you to take that joker, make sure that that's the one that has its life taken and is sacrificed on this altar to Baal. By the way, that fire that is supplied from the wood that comes from this Asherah pole and all that stuff, by the way, it also belongs to your dad. All right, so the things that we know about Gideon is this. He knows that God has given him a task. And the ultimate task is to overthrow this Midianite oppression. God wants to use him to be a deliverer for his people. But before he actually leads him to do that, what does God lead him to do? He leads him to get rid of junk in his life that shouldn't be there. Now, there's lots that we don't know about Gideon, and we don't know a great deal about his spiritual commitment and his walk with God up until this point, but it is the case, because we're clear on this. He knows that he's part of the people of God. He knows the stories of how God has worked in the lives of his people in the past, and he knows that it seems that God has turned his back on his people, and now because of their disobedience. He knows all of that, and yet he's still part of a house that has Baal and Asherah in the backyard. Why is it that he has to wait until God says to get rid of this, I really believe the answer is this. We get used to stuff easily. We get used to even unpleasant things very, very easily. And stuff that initially might have bothered us, things that initially might have been a concern, they get to a point where in short order, they don't bother us anymore. Let me give you an example. I remember vividly the first time that I ever preached here, and it was almost 13 years ago today. And so the first time I ever spoke, it was as part of a trial sermon that I was going to be preaching, and you were wowed and amazed as you are every Sunday. And so anyway, I remember, though, I think I was on that side, and I came up here, and, you know, I tend to move around as I'm preaching, and so as I get here, do you hear that? Somebody thinks that's your knee. No, that's this floor here. I promise you, the first thing that I noticed about this is that. And I remember thinking, can I preach with that? Is that going to drive me crazy? Am I going to need to stay over here? I don't know how many sermons I have preached in the last 13 years, but it's been a lot of them. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Done a lot of funerals. Done more than a couple of weddings. And you know what? the floor still squeaks. You know why? I got used to it. I mean, out of the gate, I realized that this was a problem, but pretty quickly, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. And listen, we're like that with tons of things. For example, like when you bought the home that you live in, maybe the first time that you saw it, you thought, man, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change that, and we're going to gut this, and we're going to fix that, and we're going to change this. And then 20 years later, it still looks like the day that you walked in, right? Because we'll identify things, and very quickly we will get so used to them. And that's not just true with squeaky floors or dated kitchens or ugly tile in a bathroom. It's true even of our spiritual lives. And there are things that God can prick our hearts with and say, oh, that's a problem. And the flag go up, and it ought to register with us. Oh, by the way, if you've got an altar to Baal and Asherah in your backyard. But this has been going on day in and day out, year in and year out, every day, to the point it just kind of becomes part of the background until God says that's got to go. Before God ever uses Gideon for the ultimate task to which he wants him to accomplish, what he wants him to do is to get rid of junk that's a part of his life that I think he had just gotten used to. You say, well, is that me? Now, it's possible that you could say out of the gate, and maybe even now there are things that God's impressing on your heart that he's saying, hey, you are certain this ought not be part of your life as a follower of mine. Maybe you know that. But it's entirely possible that there are other things that you haven't noticed. So here's how I would encourage you to think about it. If the Lord were to physically manifest himself tomorrow, let's say Jesus shows up and he's going to spend all day with you. And he's going to ride with you to work or to school. He's going to sit with you next to you at your desk. He's going to be right there listening to your phone calls. He's going to see your internet searches. He's going to read your text messages. He's going to do all that stuff. If the Lord were to spend tomorrow with you, what of that which he would see would you say, uh-oh? Uh-oh. Whatever that is, and I can't tell you what it is, but I believe that God right now is telling you what it is. The stuff that's there, that you would say, I could not bear to have him see that, let me just tell you, he already sees it. He already knows that it's there, and God is using, I believe, even this to tell you that that needs to get gone. That needs to be an absent part of your life. Yes, I believe there are tasks that God calls us to. There are doors of opportunity that he opens and things that he wants us to do. But before we actually begin those things, we need to make sure step one is that we start clean. But not only do we need to start clean, we need to make sure of this. We start at home. We start at home. As this passage unfolds, in verse 27, Gideon, he gets 10 of his male servants, because this is more than something that can be done just by himself. So they've got some animal help and need some people help as well. And they take down this altar to Baal. They cut down the Asherah pole, and they do this. But we're told because he was too afraid of his father's family and the men of the city to do it in the daytime, he did it at night. And maybe you're thinking, well, that stupid coward. What's he doing this at night for? Cut this down in broad daylight so that any and everybody can see. Listen, let me just tell you. God is interested in your obedience, period. God is interested in your obedience, period. Whether you like doing it, whether you are nervous about doing it, whether you are petrified about it, whether you are anxious about it, is ultimately irrelevant to the question, is God telling me to do something? God gave Gideon something to do, and it scared him. Because he was afraid, if I'm doing this and Daddy sees me, if the family sees me, if the people in town see me, well, it's going to be bad news. He's scared, so I'm going to do this at night. Okay, don't castigate him for that, because at the end of the day, what did Gideon do? He did what God said. God said to do this, and Gideon obeyed. So the next morning, we're told that the men of the city get up, and they notice they're out stretching, burping. I guess that's how God starts the day. knees sounding like. You can imagine like panning, and it catches their eye. Wait a minute. The Baal altar is gone. Asherah pole, I don't know how tall this was, but you've got to think it's taller than me. Probably something particularly tall. It's gone. In fact, they can tell that's been burned. Wait a minute. This is not an accident. This thing didn't just fall over. This is planned, intentional, premeditated. And so there's this investigation that occurs. And as they investigate, what they discover is that Gideon did this. And so they realize, verse 29, Gideon, son of Joash, did it. Verse 30, they go to Joash and they say, bring out your son, he must die. I can't tell you how many times I've had neighbors show up at my house. Joash, bring out your son, he must die. Why? He has committed a capital offense. He has sinned against our God, our gods, Baal and Asherah. We've got to show Baal and Asherah that we're serious. We've got to defend their honor. And Joash asks a question. Would you plead Baal's case for him? And the thought is this. All right, so let me get this right. You're saying we need to kill Gideon because he has offended Baal, who is our God. I tell you what, if Baal is really real, I think he'll take care of him. Let Baal contend with him. Let him be Baal's problem. In fact, after that, because of this, they start calling Gideon, you see it. Well, no, you don't see it. The translation is in verse 32, let Baal contend with him. They give him a name that means Jerubbaal, that means let Baal contend with him. It's interesting, though. Keep in mind, whose altar to Baal was it? It was Gideon's father's. Whose Asherah pole was it? It was Gideon's father's. Now, the people of the town are angry. They're furious. They literally want Gideon's head. They want him executed. But his father is the one that has experienced the greatest personal loss. And what is he doing? Well, you could argue, well, he's just defending his son. He's just trying to shield his son from their violent attacks. But I really think there's more to it than that. I believe that God has used Gideon in getting rid of this stuff to cause Gideon's own father to say, If Baal were really real, wouldn't something have happened? If Asherah really was this goddess that we have purported her to be, wouldn't something have happened? Because this is so egregious, this is so intentional, this is so destructive, this is so dishonoring. It seems that the first person that God used Gideon in godly ways, in kingdom ways, to impact was who? His own dad. His own dad. He started clean. He got the junk out of his life, but in doing so, he did so in a way that impacted not the nation of Israel, not the Midianites, but first started by impacting his own family. I've said this before, and it is the case that I have done a lot of funerals. I really have. Some are easier than others. The most difficult by far, though, are instances. In fact, when I first started pastoring, this is one of the first few that I wound up doing. It was a guy that was, deeply loved by especially the older women of the church, because this is a guy who had been so good to the widows and going to visit them and taking care packages at Christmas and going to pick them up and bring them to church. And he was so nice and so wonderful to them. And so I knew that. I'm still kind of new on the scene, and I'm hearing and I've heard these stories. But then when I meet with his family to plan this service, I hear, this joker was a dog, an absolute dog. He talked to his wife like she was dirt. I mean, she'd already died, but he was terrible to her. He was mean to his kids. They didn't really have anything of their own personal experience to be able to say positive about him. And so I find myself having to do this service where I've got to not spray him up to the crowd, but also not talk about him as though the family wouldn't even recognize him. And I remember thinking, man, it shouldn't be this way. I mean, if there's anybody that should care for him, if there's anybody in whose life he should have invested, it shouldn't have been these widows, it should have been his own family. That's where it starts. Listen, too many times we can over spiritualize the work that God calls us to and say, well, God's calling me to this location, and He's calling me to this country, He's calling me to this continent, He's calling me to this group, He's calling me to that opportunity. And that may very well be. But He's not doing so, calling you at the expense of influencing those that He's placed you among in your own family. This has application, I think, not just for individuals. I think it has application for churches. And I think one of the reasons that we see so many churches that are failing and so many churches that are closing their doors, and you can cite all sorts of reasons, and I have been through this as a pastor in Charlotte when the community looks radically different from the church that is there. And I remember one of the things that I said over and over and over and over again is this: I do not believe that God is interested in blessing a church that is indifferent to the plight of those He's placed them among. So we can think about missions on a far continent. We can think about God's work in some other place in the world. But if we are indifferent to His work right here, I don't think He's interested in blessing. Before God used Gideon out there, God used him first at home. At home. Let me just tell you this. I believe very simply that any and every person that has a real and a personal relationship with God, He wants to use you. Now, we've talked about this before. He can do it without you. There's nothing that He's deficient in. There's not something that you're bringing to the table that He doesn't have, but He wants to use you. And He may want to use you in ways that you think, I'm not equipped. God's okay with that because He is. God is interested in solidifying His call on your life and confirming in your heart and mind that which He calls you to. I think He delights in when we say, God, I really want to know what you want me to do, and I want to be certain about this. I want to know that you're in this. I think God honors that. I think He delights in that. But before we actually go off to that, God wants to make sure, I believe, as He did with Gideon, that Gideon was clean. What's the junk right now that needs to go? And as I go, before I go, I want to make sure that I'm not doing ministry there at the expense of ministry here, because it starts at home. You bow your heads with me?